Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Dr. Johannes Doemer, who is the Occupational Hygienist at WorkSafe, New Brunswick. Our topic today is going to be noise. Over the last few years, as I did workshops around the province, I had quite a number of different workplaces express a concern about the rising numbers that they were seeing in hearing loss claims being put into the organization. And it's one of those issues that, it's not like an occupational, a health and safety issue. It's an occupational health issue. And it's one of those issues that catches up to you over time. And this is what a lot of organizations were starting to realize that, maybe loose practices or things that weren't done over the years that should have been done. It's finally starting to catch up to a lot of organizations. And I think a lot of organizations for that reason are looking for solutions, are looking to have a better understanding of noise and what they should be doing to ensure that, this issue is dealt with a little more quickly than it might have been in the past. So Dr. Doemer, let's start with a comment about what is noise.
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. And you're raising a number of very good points. And it is worth to start with the basics and see what noise actually is. Noise, we define it usually as unwanted sound. So it is a bit subjective, what noise is versus what sound is. However, the idea in an occupational setting, is really that noise can impact your hearing. It can lead to, hearing effects, hearing loss, etc. Sound can do too. It depends really on the, amount of exposure, so the volume and the time that an individual is exposed to. Sound itself is pretty much vibration in the air. So when you hear something, what you actually hear is vibration that is traveling through the air. We can think of that similar to throwing a stone into a quiet lake, and you throw a stone in and you see the waves in a circular fashion expanding around that impact spot. So sound is similar. If you have a noise source or a sound source, there will be vibrations. There will be similar to a wave function, vibration patterns traveling from that noise source to eventually our ears or wherever it will impact. I like this analogy of the lake and the waves on the water also because it illustrates a little bit that the environment in which the sound occurs actually matters. So if you imagine a wave running into, let's say, a nice sandy beach, it will dissipate. It won't bounce back. Whereas if it runs into, let's say, a concrete brick wall, then the wave is gonna go against the wall and gonna be reflected backwards. The same happens with sound or with noise. So if you have materials which are porous and soft, they will dampen the sound a little, whereas materials which are hard and solid, like glass or concrete or brick, they will bounce back the sound. So especially if you think of normal industrial workplaces, they can play a factor. Because it's quite something different if you, let's say, use a circular saw outside in the open where the sound can dissipate, versus when you use it inside where the sound bounces back and it increases actually the noise levels.
Now, on the WorkSafeNB app, it talks about noise, but it also says, in addition to hearing loss, noise can also affect a person in other ways. Would you have a comment on that relative to what other ways noise can affect you beside the hearing aspect of it?
There is a safety consideration when it comes to noise in the workplace because it does hinder clear communication, of course. So there's that aspect. In a very noisy workplace, regardless or not, if you have the appropriate hearing protection, is more prone to accidents just because of impeded communications. Often people can't hear what another person is saying, or what the directions they get in terms of directional control of a vehicle, for instance. Right. So there's that aspect. There's also a psychological aspect to noise, and a stress aspect that comes from very noisy environments, even if it's an environment that doesn't quite have the same level that immediately impacts your hearing. So those aspects are also there and are real. Sometimes they're a little harder to get a grasp on, especially on the psychological side, because it often relates to what kind of noise and source it is, right? If you, for instance, I have children. If I think of children noise, and especially young children crying, that there is a psychological aspect to that increases your stress level regardless of the volume or where it happens, right, as an example. Again, those are a little bit different from, let's say, the traditional noise levels that can really impact your hearing and that have a direct impact on the hearing.
So when is noise produced? What types of situations would you really focus on? And is all noise the same? Now, you briefly alluded to it, but is all noise the same when you look at different industries, when you look at different applications?
Okay. To answer that, let's dive a little bit into how noise actually damages our hearing, then we can understand that a little better. So it really relates to how we hear as well. So we need to understand a bit on how our ear works and how we perceive sound or noise, and can interpret those vibrations that I was talking about as actual sound. An analogy that I always or often use, because I like it, is blades of grass. So your lawn out on your front, or just if you envision a field of grass, you would see those individual blades of grass. The cells in our ear that actually interpret our hearing and that we actually use for hearing are called cilia. They're little hair cells, which look quite a bit like blades of grass. And what happens in the ear is that the sound travels into the ear, goes over a series of bones, sets some liquid in motion, and this liquid then rolls, so to say, over those hair cells. So they bend based on the sound that the ear is receiving. And that's what we perceive as hearing, as sound. Now, if you think of the blades of grass, that you can, normal hearing, you can envision like a nice summer breeze going over the grass. So it bends a little and it raises back up. Hearing loss or hearing damage can occur when too loud of sounds, too loud of noise impacts those hair cells. What happens is that they can actually bend over and either break or be so bent over that they cannot raise up effectively again. And as soon as that happens, as soon as a hair cell doesn't raise up again anymore, it doesn't function as a hair cell in that sense anymore and can pick up on the sound. So we lose that information from that individual hair cells. If enough of that happens, then we lose hearing on a certain frequency branch or at a certain threshold. Now, if you think of your grass, that can happen, for instance, if a very loud noise comes by. If you think of your grass, that might be, I don't know, a bulldozer or a pickup that runs over your grass. And you look after that on your grass and you think, like, okay, great, that's damaged, right? So very loud noise can damage our hair cells as well. But what can also happen is that moderate or even comparatively low volume sounds can have an impact over time. I use the analogy of eventually you have a garden party. Like a normal person walking over the grass will not bend the grass so that it's actually damaged. But if you put 100 people on that same lawn and have them enjoy the sunset and enjoy the evening and enjoy a few drinks, then the next morning your grass will look significantly damaged. So the same happens with our hair cells. There's a sound level that we don't perceive as immediately damaging, but that over time will really impact our hearing by impacting those hair cells. And one of the unfortunate things about the hair cells is, of course, grass can grow back. Those hair cells of cilia can't. So once they're damaged, and we lose a bit of hearing on that. So they can have hearing effects. We're talking about the threshold shift, permanent or temporary. So that's what we call also hearing loss, right? The threshold is kind of the lowest volume of sound that we can detect. A threshold shift is then effectively we lose hearing. That typically happens at the higher frequency, so the high pitch noises first, and then walks into the lower frequencies as well. That's not uncommon either. Those effects are, as I said, there is a temporary version of that that can be restored. That typically happens within a day or so. You can actually make a self-assessment, a self-test. If you drive to work in the morning and you set your radio to a volume where you can just barely hear it, and you go to work, follow your day, work in the facility wherever you are, you get back into the car, and at the end of your shift, you drive home and you find yourself, you have to increase the volume. That is a temporary threshold shift, because you can't hear that well in the afternoon as in the morning anymore. Now, we let that progress and it becomes a permanent threshold shift, so hearing loss. There are also other effects like tinnitus that has a psychological component. That's a buzzing or ringing in the ear, a permanent tone. For a lot of people, that can be fairly stressful. So all of those effects, or most of those effects, have a fairly slow onset if the exposure occurs long and over time. And that means that often we have a situation where we actually do damage to our hearing in earlier years of our life. And only when it's compounded with a typical age-degenerative hearing loss, which we all suffer from, then the effects become really noticeable. So that often happens 10, 20 years after the exposure that actually caused the harm. Right. So by that time, removing from the exposure setting doesn't do anything anymore. Right. What we would consider then the occupational disease is already progressive and will continue. So those are some of our hearing effects. And earlier you asked about other, let's call them ripple effects of this. Psychosocial effects, etc. Of course, when you think of that on a personal level, one of the settings where hearing loss is first experienced and noticed by individual is a social setting often. A setting where there's background noise, because one of the symptoms is really that it becomes more difficult to distinguish sounds. So it would be more difficult to follow a conversation that you and I have when there's background noise happening. So in a social setting, at a bar or at a party or just out in a social setting. And that becomes very difficult for individuals who suffer hearing loss. So there is a component that drives individuals to remove themselves from those settings or be less prone to participate in social activities because they feel they can't connect anymore. And that certainly has a psychological component as well that leads to isolation, that leads to withdrawal, that has family impacts to also their spouses and their family members if somebody doesn't want to participate anymore, doesn't want to be connected anymore. And of course those on an individual level, those are effects which are very severely noticed, of course. Now, I'm mentioning all this to understand sound or noise damages your hearing and to illustrate how that works. in that sense, is all noise the same? You could say yes and no. In a sense, all sound is really the same because it damages your hearing at a certain level of the sound. It doesn't matter if it's wanted sound, so sound by definition, or if it's unwanted noise by definition. And I'm mentioning this because also nowadays you see a lot of people with earplugs, with earphones, with these AirPods or these little white little white sticks out of their ears, right? Where we have much more access to in-ear sound applications. If you wear that and have it at a volume that is sufficient to damage your hearing, it will damage your hearing. Doesn't matter if you chose to do so or if it's an outside noise source, right? So in that sense, all noise is the same. There's also another, so to say, there's also another way of answering this from a more scientific perspective. There are frequencies which are more damaging to the ear, yes. However, we as a layperson don't have to worry much about this because the way we measure sound is actually taking that into account. So if you heard the terms decibel A or decibel C, those are different weighting networks that give more preference to frequencies which are more damaging to our hearing. So to say, at the input, we also already take that into consideration. So when we, in the end, receive those results, we don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's one of the nice things. Yes, if you think of work environments, and different noise sources in the work environments, it always depends on the noise source, on the work environment and the resulting noise level, if it is damaging or not. But that's why we have to measure sound as well. We can't just go in and put our ear and say, oh, this is damaging or it's not. Right.
So on that, how do you measure noise?
Yes, we have different methods to measure noise. Typically, the way it is measured is it's more or less a glorified microphone, I guess, but it is calibrated so it can detect really what volume is received at the microphone. And there are two ways to do that. One is what we call an area sample. So that's a sound level meter that gives you an instantaneous readout of the noise in the moment, of the level of the noise in the moment. And there's so-called dosimetry. So dosimetry is a microphone that we attach to the worker and that can record the noise dose that the worker receives over the course of the day. So that gives you a measure of the overall exposure. So to explain that a bit, we also have to understand what our levels actually are. So excuse me if I dive a little bit into that. It's a bit technical information, but it's necessary to understand what the difference here is. In regulation, we currently set our exposure, our allowed exposure to noise, for 85 decibels for 8 hours. So what does that mean? Decibels is the scale that we measure volume or noise with. Whereas it's important to understand that the decibel scale is a logarithmic scale. It's a scale, that's not additive. So 83 decibels plus 2 decibels is not 85 decibels, unfortunately. So it actually doubles. The sound volume, it actually doubles every 3 decibels. The sound volume of an 88 decibel environment is twice as high as of an 85 decibel environment. So if we are allowed to be exposed to 85 decibels for 8 hours, that logically means that if we have an environment of 88 decibels, we are only allowed to be in there for 4 hours without damaging our hearing, right? So as I mentioned before, it depends really the volume of the noise and the length our ears are exposed to it. As we go higher, it becomes incredibly short, the window that we can be in an environment. So 88 for 91 2 hours, 94 decibels 1 hour, etc. So it becomes very short, very quick. Actually, if you would want to run through the exercise we did in a previous job, we did an exercise to calculate how much noise an unprotected ear at the would receive from a sniper gunshot. And it turned out that single shot, although the noise itself only occurs for almost like a split second, puts the individual over the 85 per 8 hour decibel limit. So it is really, in a sense, if you want to take something back from this, if you have a very noisy work environment, even very short amounts of time spent in that environment can be very damaging to the hearing.
So traditionally, to deal with those situations, measurement tools were used to determine the level, and then a number of controls were put into place. Do you want to talk about some of the controls that have been put in place over the years to try to deal with noise?
Yes. Yes. So you're right. Traditionally, that was the approach. We have a loud environment. We take a measurement. We say, oh, this is over 85 decibels. We put something in place. And unfortunately, often what happens, what I've seen in the past, is that employers think, well, we're going to put these earplug dispensers at the wall and assume everybody's protected, right? The reality is that is not really effective. When we talk about hearing protection, we often talk about earmuffs or earplugs, and we seem to neglect that there are other options of noise dampening, of hearing protection, really, when you target kind of the noise at the source. So let's talk about that first. We talk often about engineering controls. At the very beginning, I mentioned that it actually matters which wall material you might have for the sound that is perceived in a certain environment. So there are noise dampening materials that could be utilized that could actually help lowering the noise level in a certain environment. When you think of what creates noise, it's often machinery, it's engines or industrial equipment that is being utilized in the workplace. Maybe we can design equipment that it's less noisy. Noise is often a result of vibration. So if you maintain your equipment in a state that minimizes the vibration, that's not only good for the equipment and for the lifetime of the equipment, the useful lifetime of the equipment, that's also good for your noise. If you put it on dampening blocks, that's often good for noise, right? We see that effect when we think of musical instruments. The noise actually is traveling. I'm thinking of a guitar, for instance. The noise is traveling into the wood body of the guitar and is amplified there. If you would put a noise damper in between the strings and the guitar body, you would have a significantly different sounding and lower volume guitar. Same applies to industrial equipment. If you have a very vibrating and loud equipment on a hard concrete or wooden floor, that vibration will go into the floor and will, especially for wood floors, let's say, and it will amplify the sound. Whereas if you put a vibration damper in between, you have less of an effect, right? So there are ways to look at the equipment and at the noise source itself, and to implement controls which lower the noise levels in itself. And I'm mentioning this because it's important not only from a conceptual perspective. If you think of hierarchy of controls, it is always better to reduce the source itself than to try to treat, so to say, the effects at the individual, which PPE, personal protective equipment, earmuffs and earplugs certainly are. Another reason specific to noise is really that we know from experience, I say the scientific community knows from experience that hearing protectors are not as effective as we would like them to be. especially when it comes to earplugs. We do have a rating system there. It's called the NRR, noise reduction rating, that is printed on the boxes of the hearing protectors. Those are determined under ideal conditions, usually. Real world conditions is quite a bit different, especially when it comes for earplugs. And there are so-called derating factors or calculations that come into play. Typically, what we say, if you're looking at an earplug, it's only about 50% effective compared to the NRR it should be effective against, right? And that is often error of application by the user. We all have different ear canals, so it might not fit as well for you as it fits for me, or vice versa. So there are a number of factors that can impact that, and that's one of the reasons why the simple application of hearing protection doesn't necessarily give the protection we would want, and worst case, it makes it even more damaging in a sense that people put those things into their ears and think they are protected, whereas they're actually not. And that can, of course, cause more harm to the situation than help it. So for all those reasons, also we, and I say we in New Brunswick, or WorkSafe New Brunswick, is taking a newer approach to this, and that is the introduction of the idea of really the hearing conservation concept. And hearing conservation is really more a concept or an approach to proactively deal with noise, and provides a number of elements that employers can or must, depending on the situation, implement into their workplace in order to address the noise hazard. Other than what we had so far was really a requirement to measure noise in the workplace, yes, and to limit the noise exposure to the individual, but not with not much guidance. And it also left it up to the employer how to do that. So simple application of earplugs, for instance, would have been acceptable. Now, again, we're shifting a little bit of that, and that's the idea of this introduction of hearing conservation. The hearing conservation aspect also requires now companies or employers to implement a so-called hearing conservation code of practice once they are at a certain threshold of noise in the workplace. So that specifically relates to if your work area it exceeds 85 decibel and you're running 8-hour shifts, then a code of practice for hearing conservation would be required, or would start to be required. So it ties it to the same kind of exposure limits that I was talking about earlier.
So what would you require in a code of practice in that situation?
Yeah.
What would you like to see?
Yes, and I think the better terminology is actually what will be required, because again, these are pending updates to the regulation, and they will fairly soon be in effect. So by then, at the moment it's a recommendation, but by then it won't be a recommendation anymore. It will be required by employers to implement this. So the code of practice itself, yes, that's of course a written program, essentially a consolidation of the policies and procedures for hearing conservation that the employer will have to have in place. And the regulation will also be fairly descriptive about the elements that will be required in the code of practice. It starts with the noise levels itself. So as I mentioned, there is a requirement to measure noise levels. Logically, those measured noise levels will make it into the code of practice as kind of the base. Okay, this is where we are. This is what we have to deal with. It will describe where those apply, so the location where the code of practice applies, as well as where the noise levels are. It will require the employer to look at noise control measures. And noise control measures, the terminology is chosen because it differentiates it from hearing protectors. So noise control measures aside from hearing protectors, earmuffs and earplugs. Those still have a place, of course, but you should take a look at other control options, engineering control options, first to see if you can reduce your noise that way, because we know it's more effective. Then it will go into PPE. So what kind of earmuffs, what kind of earplugs are selected, can be used? Is there double hearing protection required, for instance? It will be based on the noise levels that were measured and the time individuals spend in those areas. Training of employees will be required. Signage requirements. There's a requirement to have signage at access points to work areas that exceeds 85 decibels. And one of the biggest additions in the regulation is that there will be hearing tests required. So there will be audiological assessments required. Those have to be done up and higher within the first 6 months of employment, and then every 2 years at a minimum after. Recommended would be every year, but at a minimum every 2 years. And there's also the requirement of an annual review of the code of practice itself.
So will this be required of all workplaces, or
of all workplaces that have work areas exceeding the occupational exposure limits? So if you run 8-hour shifts in a workplace, if you have a work area where individuals work that exceeds 85 decibels, then you would be required to implement the code of practice. Yes.
Okay. Now, are there other new technologies that can assist in helping to protect workers when it comes to hearing?
Yes. There are some interesting developments in the last years, let's say. So some of which relate to hearing protectors itself. So it's devices that allow the fit testing for hearing protectors. So similar to respiratory equipment, we can fit test, ensure that the piece of PPE that you have, in this case an earplug or an earmuff, is actually fitting correctly. I used the example of earplugs and that they are not as effective as we would like them to be from experience prior. So one way of going about that is, of course, to just overall say, okay, we only assume they are 50% effective. Another approach would be to have actually a test that can show you how well it's fitted on an individual employee. And those devices exist now. We actually internally played around with those to get some experience and fit tested a number of employees as well. It is quite interesting. There are different technologies out there. Some, so to say, in a sense, put a microphone into your protected ear, so through the earplug. Some look just like regular earmuffs and do a hearing test, so to say, with and without hearing protection, and they can calculate the difference. So there are different technologies. But one thing we hope to notice, and we did notice, is that this is a great educational experience for the individual who is being tested, because you can really see how well an earplug fits, how deep it has to be in your ear canal, because most of it, to be effective, it's not comfortable, quite frankly. And you can see that clearly in the test results. For, I would say, the majority of the individuals we tested, we had to go back and say, okay, try to insert that a little bit deeper. Try to push it in a little bit deeper. Maybe you can get a better protection. And it made a huge impact. For some individuals, we actually had eye-opening moments where they thought, well, I'm using this hearing protector, this earplug, for years now. I always thought I was protected, but the device shows me there's zero to very little protection. Those were eye-opening moments, of course. So there is definitely development in this, and the fit testing we saw as a very worthy addition to a potential hearing conservation program, right? So if you look at it from a hearing conservation code of practice perspective, you can tie that into your selection of hearing protectors, have a really teachable moment there, and really have a better have a much more solid selection of your hearing protection, and so very beneficial in that regard as well. And some jurisdictions already picked up on this as very noteworthy. So I think Alberta has it now mandatory. So similar to respiratory fit testing, that hearing protector fit testing is required there. We are not there yet, but we do encourage using it in terms of the code of practice for hearing conservation. Now, the other thing is, and this is not necessarily a new technology, but so to say new to New Brunswick, is really the hearing test, the audiological assessments. We believe they will have a big impact on protection of employees, and the reason for this is really. Well, if you think about it, you might think, okay, hearing test, yeah, fine, we're going to do a hearing test. It's going to show us that our hearing conservation program is actually working. And yes, that's the intent. However, it is really, for some of the reasons I mentioned, one of the very few ways to actually show that your hearing protection in the workplace is working. You can measure your levels, you can select the appropriate hearing protection, but you can even fit test, but you don't really have control on day-to-day operations if your employees insert the earplugs correctly, if they get the protection they need. The only way to verify that is really with audiological assessments, and to see if there's a difference in the hearing. And as I mentioned at the beginning, often the damage is done at an age and at a level where it's not noticeable. So if you or I had hearing damage done 20 years ago we wouldn't have noticed this. Our hearing was still in such good shape that any damage experienced at that time, you would not notice. You would not notice in day-to-day operation, even through that little temporary threshold exercise that I mentioned earlier, you wouldn't notice this until really it is too late. Unless you do hearing tests and do regular audiological assessments, and those can pick up on the fact, oh, wait a second, we do have a little drop in decibels, a little drop in threshold here. And that happens at a time where we still have sufficient time to interfere with the situation and to stop the exposure, to actually prevent the permanent damage and to prevent the lasting damage of hearing loss. So those are the kind of two new enhancements, I would say, coming to New Brunswick. One through regulation, and the other one is in technological, the fit testing. And both are which we're quite excited about.
So when I started the podcast, I talked about anecdotally, I'm hearing that hearing loss is a big issue. From your perspective and WorkSafe's perspective, how big an issue is hearing loss in New Brunswick?
It is big. It is a big issue. So if I pulled the data over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, we had roughly 3,300 claims related to hearing loss, and WorkSafe New Brunswick spent about $22 million in hearing loss claims. So it is a significant issue. It is a big issue, and as I mentioned, most of the groundwork for the hearing damage that we see now would have happened decades ago, like 1 or 2 decades ago, typically.
So obviously today you pointed out so many different aspects of noise and hearing loss and so on. How can workplaces go about to get more information on hearing loss and on get a sort of a heads up on what's coming down in legislation and what they should be thinking about putting in place?
Okay. So the best starting point for that is, quite frankly, our website, WorkSafeNB.ca. We do have a noise safety topic. So if you go to the website, to the safety topics, there's a noise topic. That is still under the wording of the, so to say, old legislation, but it will change very soon as the new one comes into effect. The public review for the new legislation just ended. So we expect to see it in regulation very soon. If you would like a heads up on the wording of the new regulation, reach out to us. We are more than happy to provide that, but knowing that, yes, this is still technically in draft form. As I said, we are not anymore working. They are already sitting in the drawer. We do have updates to the noise safety topic, and those will be published as soon as that changeover occurs. We will also have a guide to automatic testing, because we do realize that this is something that's new to New Brunswick employers. So we want to provide the necessary resources and guidance in that for that as well. And we will also, of course, have some information of how to generate an appropriate code of practice. So all that can be found on our noise safety topic online. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of information on noise and sound and the damages of it. We do have links to other resources. Typically the CCOHS, or the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, has quite a bit of information online. We link to that as well, and all that you can find again on our website on the noise safety topic.
Well, look, Johannes, thank you very much for joining us today on our podcast. We so often talk about safety in the workplace. We don't often talk enough about occupational health issues such as noise, hearing loss, and so on. And it's always good to remind folks that these are issues, we don't hear about them on a day-to-day basis. They're things, as you said, that sort of over time they catch up to us. And certainly today you pointed out how they can catch up to us over time, and how something that may have happened 20 years ago, a workplace or a situation, may actually have been the result of, or caused hearing loss at that time, but we won't notice it for a period later. So thank you very much for joining us. Again, for folks looking for information, go to the WorkSafeNB website, look under noise, lots of good information. Also, occupational hygienists in the different regions around the province can help you as well. We always appreciate any ideas you might have for folks listening to our podcast. If you'd like to send them off to us, we'd love to hear from you. It's at podcast@ssnb.ca. Stay safe. See you next week.